They already knew the wood was worthless. 14 years of evidence, in daylight, in front of everyone in that part of California. A giant sequoia comes down 200 feet onto a mountainside and the wood explodes. Half the tree, and on the biggest as much as 80%, stays in the dirt because it costs more to move than it sells for. What survives goes out as grape stakes, fence posts, matchsticks. And in the winter of 1896, a company that had never turned a profit in a single season, that had been reorganized twice and foreclosed on once, sent 100 men into the Sierra Nevada in deep snow to build the largest saw in the world. 90 feet of steel welded into a loop running through a wooden building on 1,000 horsepower of steam. It had to be that size. The logs coming to it were 15 feet across, wider than most rooms in most American houses, and no other mill on the continent could open them. 400 men stood inside that building with it. No guard on it, no screen, nothing between a working man and the blade. When a band that size lets go, it comes off the wheels into the room. They fed it for 8 years. 8,000 giant sequoias went down, trees already old when Rome was founded. The company still never made a dollar. So who signed that order? And before we move on, if this kind of history matters to you, please subscribe and hit the like button. It keeps this channel alive. Thank you. Stay with this, because the men who worked that saw left almost nothing behind, and what survived only did so because somebody was forced to file it in a courtroom. Converse Basin sits about 5 miles north of Grant Grove in what is now the giant Sequoia National Monument on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada in Fresno County, California. 4,600 acres of it. Before anyone put an axe into it, it held the densest concentration of giant sequoias anywhere on the planet. Understand what that means. The largest living things that have ever existed on this planet by volume, standing together in one bowl of ground, thousands of them. Stand at the base of one. The trunk goes up 20 feet through, and it does not taper. On a pine, the trunk narrows as your eye climbs. On a mature sequoia, it rises like a column, holding its width for 100 feet before the first branch, and the branches themselves are the size of full-grown trees anywhere else in the country. The bark runs a foot or two thick, soft and fibrous, and it does not burn easily. That bark is why these trees live for millennia. The oldest stump anyone has counted the rings on in that basin came in just over 3,200 years old. There is a dead snag still standing there that was around 3,500 years old when it died. Now put a lumberman in front of that, because this has to be said plainly or none of the rest makes sense. A single mature giant sequoia held more usable board footage than an entire acre of white pine. One tree. The largest of them could theoretically yield 500,000 board feet. And the men who came for them were not fools or amateurs. Through the 1870s and 1880s, the lumber industry of Michigan and Wisconsin had cut through the white pine of the Great Lakes and was running out of trees. Those crews, that capital, and that way of thinking went looking for the next stand. To a man who had spent 20 years counting timber by the acre, Converse Basin was a vault with the door standing open. The man who saw it first was Charles Porter Converse. Born in Michigan in 1816, came out in the gold rush, and by the 1860s he had his eye on that basin. His plan was to float the trees down the Kings River to a mill in the valley. He formed the Kings River Lumber Company in 1876. Then the economy turned, and he walked away from it. He spent his last years calling himself a mining expert in San Francisco and struggling for work. He drowned in San Francisco Bay. The basin still carries his name. The men who did it came later, and they had a tool Converse never had. In 1878, Congress passed the Timber and Stone Act. The idea on paper was to let ordinary citizens buy 160 acres of timberland from the federal government for a small fee. What it did in practice was hand the Sierra Nevada to whoever could organize enough bodies. In 1888, Hiram Smith and Austin Moore founded the Kings River Lumber Company. They went looking for men who had not yet used their claim. Stagecoaches ran between the mountains and the land office to speed the filing along. The claims went in, the deeds came out, and the deeds were transferred for cash. 30,000 acres of old-growth sugar pine and giant sequoia, acquired 160 acres at a time, by men who mostly never intended to set foot on the land they had sworn to settle. Nobody was ever prosecuted for it. Hold on to that, because everything the machine did later rests on it. The trees cost almost nothing. Buying the forest was never the problem. Getting it down the mountain was. And that problem is what built the monster. They started with a flume, 54 miles of V-shaped wooden trough running from the mountain mills down to the railhead at Sanger in the valley, dropping 4,200 feet along the way. It was built out of knot-free sequoia carried on trestles of pine and cedar. It consumed 9 million board feet of lumber to construct. It cost around $300,000, which in the money of that decade was a staggering sum for a wooden ditch. They finished it on the 3rd of September, 1890. And it worked. Sawn lumber was clamped into blocks, the blocks linked into trains, and the trains rode the water down the mountain. 15 hours from the High Sierra to the railhead. Nothing in commercial lumber moved that fast anywhere in the world. Men called flume herders walked that line day and night, watching for jams and telephoning in damage. Around the flume head they built a town called Millwood. Hotel, saloons, stores, families. A settlement that existed to keep water and timber moving the same direction. Step back and look at what they had built by 1893. A dam and a lake to hold the water. 54 miles of trough to carry it, a town to run the trough, a hoist to lift loaded cars over a ridge, a finishing plant and a box factory waiting at the bottom in Sanger. All of it existed to feed one building. That is the shape to hold for the rest of this. A single mechanism 60 miles long with a saw in the middle of it and everything upstream and downstream built to keep that saw supplied. A mechanism like that has one requirement. It cannot be switched off cheaply. Then they added a railroad, narrow gauge, 3 feet, built in 1891 to reach timber the flume could not. Their first locomotive was a 36-ton shay named Sequoia, hauled up from the valley in pieces by teams and wagons and bolted back together in the mountains. In 1891, the cut went over 20 million board feet for the first time. It was not enough. That sentence governs this entire story. 20 million board feet of lumber, and it did not cover what they had already spent on the mill, the flume, and the railroad. The debt was bigger than the forest could pay. There was a second problem underneath it, and the market had already noticed. Sequoia lumber did not command the price of pine. Builders would not trust it for structural work, and it went out of the yard at a discount into fencing and stakes and shingles. So the company was hauling the largest trees on earth down 4,000 feet of mountain to sell them as some of the cheapest wood on the list. So they went deeper. In 1893, a new 7-mile railway pushed into Converse Basin itself, and for the first time, the greatest grove of giant sequoias on the planet was inside reach of industrial machinery. The creditors reorganized the company as the Sanger Lumber Company in 1894. It kept losing money. The creditors foreclosed in 1895. In 1896, the operation cut 22 million board feet. Still not enough. Now hold that question in your head. 2 reorganizations, a foreclosure, 14 years of evidence, and a forest that had never once paid for itself. What do you do next? They built the biggest saw in the world. To understand why the machine had to be that size, you have to understand why every mill in America was useless in front of these trees. The standard American head rig in the 1890s was a circular saw, a steel disc with teeth around the rim, and it has one hard limit built into its geometry. It can only cut to a little less than half its own diameter, because the arbor and the collar and the frame all have to sit somewhere. A 60-inch blade opens a log about 2 feet through. Mills that needed more ran a double circular, one saw above and one below, and even that topped out around 7 feet. The sections coming out of Converse Basin were 10 feet through, 12, 15, some larger. You cannot build a circular saw big enough. Try it, and the physics turn on you. Double the diameter, and the rim speed climbs. The plate has to thicken to stay stiff, and the mass out at the edge starts trying to tear the blade apart from the inside. Then there is the sawdust, which decided the whole industry. Every cut destroys a strip of wood the width of the blade. That strip is the kerf, and it becomes dust. A heavy circular saw throws away 1/4 of an inch or more with every pass. A bandsaw, a thin ribbon rather than a stiff plate, throws away a fraction of that. On a normal log, the difference is a nuisance. On a 15-foot sequoia section, where every pass runs 15 feet, it is an entire wall of lumber turned to dust with each stroke. So the bandsaw solved 2 problems at once. A bandsaw is not a disc. It is a continuous ribbon of steel welded into an endless loop, running over 2 large wheels, one above the deck and one below. The cutting happens on the straight run between them. The depth of cut is not limited by the blade at all. It is limited only by how far apart you set the wheels and how tall you build the frame. So they set the wheels far apart and built the frame tall. The mill went up over the winter and started work on the 30th of June, 1897. 400 men, 2 band saws, a 1,000-horsepower steam engine driving the entire plant, and a band 90 feet around, which the record calls the longest bandsaw in the world, able to halve and quarter many of the largest sequoia sections. Sit with that number. A normal band mill of that era ran a blade around 40 or 50 feet in circumference. This was roughly double. Here is what that bought and why anyone signed the check. A band mill of this class put a log through faster than any circular head and wasted far less of it. The flume below could carry 250,000 board feet a day. The company's better seasons had already reached 22 million, and management believed the ceiling was far higher because the ceiling would no longer be the saw. Put a machine at the head of the plant that can open anything standing in the forest, and the numbers stop looking like a gamble and start looking like a solved problem waiting for volume. That was the case for building it. Bigger trees, bigger machinery, bigger cut, and the debt comes off. Every step in that reasoning was sound except the last one. Here is how the power reached it. Boilers first, burning mill waste and forest slash, because there was no shortage of either. Steam into an engine putting out 1,000 horsepower. The engine turned a flywheel. The flywheel drove a main-line shaft running the length of the building, and off that line shaft hung a forest of leather belts, some of them 2 feet wide, slapping and running overhead across the whole mill floor. No guards, no cages. Belts everywhere, at head height and above, moving all day, every day. One of those belt drives spun the lower band wheel. The band ran up over the top wheel and back down, and the top wheel was mounted on a slide with weights or a screw applying constant tension. That tension arrangement is the part people miss, and it is the heart of the machine. A band saw only cuts straight because it is stretched tight. Slack the band off, and it flutters in the cut, wanders off the line, and comes out the far side with a wave through it. So the top wheel gets pulled up hard, putting many thousands of pounds of pull into a ribbon of steel roughly as thick as a dime. But steel expands when it gets hot, and a blade dragging through 3,000-year-old heartwood gets very hot. As the band heats, it lengthens. As it lengthens, the tension falls off. If nothing compensates, the cut starts to wander inside a log worth more than a man earned in a year. So the top wheel is not fixed. It rides. It moves up and down constantly, all shift, taking up the slack as the steel breathes. A machine the size of a barn, and the thing holding it true is a wheel allowed to float. Now the log, and this is where the real engineering problem lives. Before the blade can touch anything, a section of sequoia has to get onto the carriage. The carriage is a heavy-wheeled frame running on rails alongside the blade, and the log has to be lying on it, clamped, square, and in the right position. Think about what they were moving. A 10-foot section of green sequoia, 20 feet long, weighs on the order of 50 tons. You cannot roll that with cant hooks. You cannot lift it with men. Ordinary mills used a jackladder to drag logs up out of the pond and gravity and muscle to place them, and none of that scales to this. So the moving of the log became its own machine. Steam-powered arms in the deck, driven straight off the boiler, came up under the log to roll it and turn it. Steam kickers threw it across. Steam-driven dogs bit down and clamped it. From the moment a sequoia section reached the mill until the moment it left as boards, no human being ever moved it. Men only decided where it went. A steam feed then drove the carriage past the blade at cutting speed, and mechanisms called setworks advanced the log sideways by the exact thickness of the next board before the carriage came back for another pass. The sawyer stood at a bank of levers on a platform, running the whole sequence by hand and eye. He decided where every cut went. And riding the carriage itself, moving with the log, were the setters. Men rode the log past the blade. That was normal. Every band mill in America worked that way. It becomes something else only when the log on the carriage weighs as much as a locomotive, and the blade beside it is 90 feet of tensioned steel traveling, on a mill of that period, at something close to 1.5 miles through the cut every minute. There is one more thing the sawyer had to read, and it is specific to these trees. Sequoia is prone to what timbermen call shake, a separation between the growth rings inside the trunk. A tree that has stood for 3 millennia has been through fires and lightning and windstorms, and the damage is inside, invisible. A log can look perfect on the deck and come apart into curved, worthless slabs the moment the saw opens it. So a sawyer could put a 50-ton section through the biggest saw on the continent and produce firewood, with no way to know beforehand. That should tell you something about the odds this operation was running. Now the one room in every band mill that decides whether anyone goes home. The filing room. The filer was the highest-paid man in most mills, often better paid than the superintendent, because everything depended on him. Bands came off the wheels constantly. Every tooth had to be swaged out and sharpened. And then the blade went onto a long anvil, and the filer hammered it by hand, working out the internal stresses, rolling tension into the middle of the band so it would sit properly on the crown of the wheel. Get that wrong, and cracks start at the base of the teeth. Sequoia made it worse. The wood is stringy and fibrous wood packs the gullets between the teeth instead of clearing them. Packed gullets mean friction. Friction means heat. Heat means the band grows, the tension drops, the cut wanders, and the cracks in the steel open a little further with every revolution. And every so often, a band breaks. 90 feet of steel under thousands of pounds of tension, moving at speed, releases all of it at once and comes off the wheels. Nobody in that building could outrun it. And the band was only the first station. Whatever came off the headrig went on down the plant to resaws and edgers and trimmers, each one belt-driven off the same line shaft, each one turning, each one open. The band saw is the machine people photographed. It sat at the head of a chain of machinery that filled the building. Which brings us to the thing about all of this that nobody at the time seems to have wanted to say plainly. It worked. The engineering was sound. It could open a 15-foot log, and no other mill in the country could. The saw was never the problem. The problem was upstream of it, out in the woods, and it had been proven years before the first band was ever hung on those wheels. But hold that. First, the decision itself, because it is on the record. Through the winter of 1896 into 1897, with the permission of the creditors who had just foreclosed on the company, a crew of 100 men stayed in the mountains through the snow, tearing down the machinery at Millwood and Abbott Creek and hauling it into Converse Basin. They rebuilt the hoist. They improved the incline railway. On the 8th of January 1897, the Hanford Journal ran a short item about the work. The headline said, "Heavy snows had delayed the location of the double mill." That is it. That is the moment. 100 men in the snow and 2 lines in a country newspaper. Remember it. We come back to it. That is what the machine looked like on paper, in horsepower and tension and feet per minute. It looked like an answer to an engineering problem. Inside the basin, in the mud and the smoke, it looked like something else entirely. The men there measured this operation in a different unit, and the unit was their own bodies. What comes next survived only because a lawyer had to file it. Start where the tree starts. 2 men would build a platform out from the trunk, above the swell of the buttress where the wood ran straighter. They stood on that with double-bitted axes and cut a deep notch into the face. Then the crosscut saw went in on the far side. These were enormous saws, and when a tree was too wide for one, they brazed 2 together end to end and pulled it with 4 men. Then they drove steel wedges into the cut behind the blade, because the weight above wanted to close the kerf and pinch the saw solid. This took a week, sometimes longer. The Mark Twain tree, dropped in 1891, took 2 men 13 days. The General Noble tree, cut in Converse Basin in August 1892, took 5 men 13 days from a scaffold 50 feet in the air, because they were cutting the trunk at 52 feet above the ground, where it was still nearly 20 feet through. That one nearly killed all of them. The tree came off the wedges early and fell the wrong way, straight into the scaffolding they were standing on. There was no way down. As the platform collapsed underneath them, the men jumped onto the stump they had just made and threw themselves flat, while 3,000 years of wood came down beside them. They lived. And here is what the General Noble tree was cut for. Not lumber. It was cut to be an exhibit. They hollowed it out, cut it into 46 pieces, some over 4 tons, hauled them out on wagons pulled by 16 mules, loaded 11 railroad cars, and reassembled a section inside the government building at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, with a staircase up the inside so visitors could climb it. Total cost, $10,475.87. Visitors looked at it and decided it was fake. They called it the California hoax. President Grover Cleveland is said to have doubted it was real. After the fair, it went to Washington, got a roof put on it, and served as a tourist attraction for about 40 years. When it rotted too far to be safe, groundskeepers at the Department of Agriculture turned it into a storage shed. The largest tree ever felled by human beings, cut down to prove it existed. Nobody believed it. It ended as a shed. Now back to the woods, because the felling was only the beginning of the violence. Sequoia wood is brittle, not soft, brittle. When a trunk weighing over 1,000 tons falls 200 feet onto a mountainside, the wood does not bend, it explodes. Loggers knew this, so they built what they called feather beds, leveling the ground where the tree would land and packing it with branches and leaves to absorb the shock. When they could, they felled in winter into deep snow for the same reason. It helped. It did not solve anything. Estimates from the era and surveys made in the 1930s put the loss at between half and 80% of the merchantable wood left on the ground, not worth the cost of moving. And then, for anything over about 8 feet through, they brought in black powder. They bored holes into the fallen trunk and blasted it into pieces small enough for the donkey engines and the flat cars to handle. Now read that against everything you have just learned about the mill. They built the most precise large cutting instrument on the continent, a 90-foot band, hand-hammered by the highest-paid man in the plant, tensioned to thousandths of an inch, running on a floating wheel to hold a true line through 15 feet of wood. And they fed it logs they had blown apart with explosives, the finest saw in the world, standing downstream of a powder charge. From the blast site, the pieces went into log chutes. These were troughs made of logs laid parallel, carried across gullies on trestles and cribwork, and the pieces running down them were up to 24 feet long and up to 10 feet in diameter. Donkey engines dragged them. A man called a trail rider went down at the back end of the string of logs, working a bell system to signal the hoist operator at the mill and control the speed of the whole train. Picture that job. You are at the tail of a moving line of logs, each bigger than a railway carriage, running down a wooden trough on a mountainside, and your instrument for controlling it is a bell. Logs came out of the chutes. Trains buckled and threw pieces off sideways. The friction of wood dragging over wood set fires. And the lumber still was not in the valley. Converse Basin sat in a bowl, so the company built an incline hoist and hauled loaded railroad cars by cable to the summit of Hoist Ridge at 6,700 feet. At the top, the cable was moved to the other end of the train and the cars were lowered down the far side to the railhead, where a shay took them to Millwood and the flume took the lumber to Sanger. Loaded cars, on a cable, over a ridge. And inside the building, the conditions were their own kind of weather. Sequoia dust is fine and red, and it hangs in the air, all shift and settles on everything, and the men breathed it for 11 hours at a stretch. The deck stayed wet. The floor moved under them with the carriage. Nobody wore anything on their ears because nothing existed to wear, and 1,000 horsepower of belted machinery inside a wooden building is a sound you take in your chest. Now think about where a man had to stand. The setter rode the carriage past the blade at cutting speed, with his body a few feet from the steel, out and back, all day. The off-bearer worked the far side, pulling boards away as they came off. The sawyer stood at his levers within arm's reach of the band. Overhead, the belts ran. No screen, no guard, no barrier of any kind, because in 1897 nobody built one. If the band came apart, it came apart into the room where they were standing. The men who did all of this worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, April to November, for $1.50 to $2.50 a day, less the cost of their room and board. California had no workmen's compensation law until 1913. I want to tell you where the record of these men survives, because it is not in the company files. There is no ledger of the injured at Converse Basin. What survives is scattered through country newspapers and courtroom filings, which means a man's arm only entered history if someone sued or if an editor thought it worth 2 inches of column space. The company ran its own hospital in the woods. The company also chose who worked in it. Everything else is gone. So when you read the cases that survived, you are reading the small fraction of the harm that generated paperwork. That is the part that stays with me. Not the ones on the list. The size of the list that is missing. And here is where that absence answers a question I raised earlier. I told you what happens when a 90-foot band lets go. Every filer in America understood it. Every man on that deck understood it. In 8 years of running 2 of the largest band saws ever built, through the most fibrous, most heat-packing wood any of them had ever cut, those bands came off the wheels. There is no record of it. Not one broken band injury from Converse Basin survives in any file I have been able to reach. That does not mean it never happened. It means nobody was required to write it down. Before 1913, there was no compensation board, no schedule, no form to complete. A man went to a company hospital staffed by people the company chose, and unless he could afford a lawyer, that was the end of the paperwork. The saw's worst day is missing from the record because nothing existed to catch it. In 1894, a 15-year-old boy named Fred Jones was hurt in the operation and treated by a man who presented himself as a doctor and was not one. The treatment was wrong. Fred Jones lost his hand. 15 years old. Nobody was ever charged. Now here is the part where it should get better. Because it did, on paper. In 1913, after decades of pressure from labor and from reformers, California finally passed a workmen's compensation law. For the first time, a man crushed in a mill or a boy maimed in the woods would not be left to hire a lawyer and prove negligence against a company that owned the doctor who had treated him. There was a schedule now. There was an award. The state had finally put itself between the machine and the men, and the operation in Converse Basin was inside the new law. The law took effect. The operation kept running. And we can measure exactly what it was worth, because two of the awards survive. On the 13th of June 1914, a man named C.M. Mooney was struck by debris from an explosion set to uproot a tree. The company was ordered to pay him $104.67. On the 20th of October 1914, Orlando V. Carter, a night watchman, fell through an opening in the machine room and died. The company was ordered to pay his widow $2,490. That is the number. That is what the reform bought her. The mill did not stop. The season finished on schedule. Nobody ever explained why an opening in the floor of a machine room was still uncovered in a plant that had been running for 17 years. If you have stayed with this, you now know something almost nobody who walks that basin will ever be told. Not the stumps, which everyone sees. Not the size of the trees, which is on every sign at every trailhead. You know the name of the night watchman, and the price the state put on his life, and that the machine he died inside was built on a decision the company's own ledgers gave them every reason not to make. Which brings us to what happened when the basin ran out. By the early 1900s, the arithmetic was closing in. The grove was finite. The machine was not. There is no version of that equation where the trees win. In 1905, the operation was sold. Thomas Hume and Ira Bennett, Michigan lumbermen, bought the Sanger Lumber Company and formed the Hume-Bennett Lumber Company. The purchase included 22,240 acres in Converse Basin. 16,960 of those acres had already been logged. 5,280 still had timber standing on them. Look at that ratio, 3/4 of the ground already stripped, in 8 seasons. In that same year, 1905, fire destroyed the Converse Basin sawmill. They rebuilt it. They rebuilt the biggest saw in the world, in a basin that was 3/4 cut out, and ran it for 2 more years before the numbers finally made it impossible. Then the operation moved. The remaining structures at Converse Basin were burned. Some accounts describe that burning as deliberate. Nobody ever explained why. And this is where the machine itself goes quiet, which I did not expect when I started looking. Follow the rest of the equipment, and you can track it item by item. The Shea locomotives are catalogued by builder and shop number. The flume was extended, then burned in a forest fire in 1926. The dam is still standing and still holding water. 70 railroad cars, 12 steam donkeys, a McGiffert loader, a railroad crane. All accounted for. The 90-foot band is not accounted for anywhere. Nobody recorded whether it burned in 1905 or was hauled north to Hume or was cut up and sold as scrap by the ton. The largest cutting instrument of its kind on Earth was built with intent, described in the press, photographed on its deck, and then it stops appearing in the paperwork. They wrote down the weight of the locomotives. They did not write down what became of the saw. What was left in the basin afterward was scavenging. Small crews picking through the wreckage of the grove for anything the first pass had missed, and it went on into the 1910s. The company moved north and built a new complex at a place they named Hume, and it is worth seeing how good these people were at the parts of the job that were not the problem. They hired an engineer named John Samuel Eastwood and had him dam 10 Mile Creek. Chinese-American crews built it out of 2,207 cubic yards of concrete and 8 miles of steel cable, finished in November 1908 for around $35,000. Filled in June 1909, it created an 87-acre lake to serve as a log pond and flume head. That dam was 677 feet long, and it was the first multiple arch dam ever built anywhere in the world. It is still standing today. They extended the flume by another 17 miles, making it 73 miles from Hume down to Sanger, the longest log flume ever constructed. By the 1st of June 1910, the mill was turning out close to 100,000 feet of lumber a day. And then, during the recession of 1913 and 1914, with pine soft, the company went back to the giant sequoias. They converted the rail lines from narrow gauge to standard gauge to carry the larger loads. They bought 50 more logging cars. In 1915, George Hume bought a third shay and more yarding engines, building the outfit up to 70 railroad cars, 3 locomotives, 12 steam donkeys, a McGiffert loader, and a railroad crane. For the 1916 season, they hired 1,500 men and prepared for one of the heaviest cuts in the company's history. Then it ended, quickly. In 1917, the war took 40% of the workforce and made equipment and supplies difficult to get. In November of that year, the Hume mill burned. The newspapers called it a $500,000 fire. The Sanger Lumber Company closed for good in 1924. 36 years, 3 reorganizations, the longest flume on Earth, the first multiple-arch dam on Earth, the longest bandsaw on Earth. Not one profitable year. Wrong. That is how the story is usually told, and it is incomplete because it lets the whole thing sit as a business misfortune. A bad bet. Men who did not know any better. They knew better. It is on the record, and it was on the record before the mill was built. Go back to Big Stump Basin, 4 miles away. Between 1883 and 1889, the Smith Comstock Mill worked that grove and took nearly all of it. What Smith Comstock learned there was learned in public, in daylight, in front of everyone in that part of California. The trees shattered. Recovery ran to roughly a quarter of the wood. What survived went out as fence posts and vineyard stakes. Smith Comstock stopped. Then in 1891, the Mark Twain tree came down in that same basin. Then in 1892, the General Noble tree came down in Converse Basin, cut by the Kings River Lumber Company itself, and the company's own men stood there and watched what a trunk that size does when it hits the ground. Then came the ledgers, 20 million board feet in 1891, not enough to service the debt, reorganization in 1894, foreclosure in 1895, 22 million board feet in 1896, still not enough. And in the winter of 1896, the creditors who had already foreclosed on this company approved 100 men to spend a Sierra winter hauling machinery into the last great grove of giant sequoias on Earth, so that a 90-foot saw blade could be hung there. Every fact needed to predict the outcome was in their hands before that order was given. Now line the rest of it up. The claims were filed by men who were paid to file them. The deeds were transferred for cash. The company was reorganized, sold, renamed, and then renamed back to the name it had already failed under. The waste was never measured. The failure was never investigated. The land was never taken back from anyone. The mill was rebuilt after it burned, in a basin already 3/4 stripped, and the reasoning behind rebuilding it was never set down anywhere a shareholder could read it. Nobody ever explained why, and there was no authority above them to say no. The Timber and Stone Act had already handed over the ground in 1888, so by the time anyone with power cared what was happening in Converse Basin, the entire grove was private property, being processed by a machine its owners had every legal right to run. The people who could see it happening had nothing but words. Public disgust at what was done in these groves is a real part of why Sequoia, General Grant, and Yosemite were protected, and why almost every surviving sequoia grove was in public hands by the 1950s. Converse Basin was not saved. Converse Basin was the price. Here is what happened to the ground itself, and this part has not stopped. In 1935, George Hume sold the remainder of the company to the United States Forest Service. Dam, land, everything. The government paid about $15 an acre. The public bought back, with money, the land it had given away for a filing fee after the trees were gone. And the mismanagement did not end when the machinery left. The Forest Service planted single-species conifer plantations to bring the forest back. Those plantations are prone to pests and have disrupted the water cycle, producing dead trees and heavy fuel loads. A century of suppressing fire, in a forest whose greatest trees depend on fire to reproduce, stacked the rest up. In 1955, the McGee Fire burned most of Converse Basin and killed the young sequoias that had come back. In 2015, the Rough Fire burned much of the same ground again. Crews wrapped the Chicago stump in fire shelters to keep it from going. 130 years after the saw arrived, they are still going into that basin to protect what is left from decisions made by people who are all dead. Nobody ever explained why the repair keeps falling to the public and the profit never did. That is why this is not a closed file. The names on the paperwork change. The pattern of a place handed to whoever can extract from it fastest and then handed back to the public to repair has not. Which is the reason to pass this one on. Almost everyone who drives Highway 180 past that basin sees second growth and stumps and assumes it was ignorance. It was a documented decision made twice by people holding the evidence in their own account books. If 90% of the people who see this send it to one other person, that stops being the version of the story that survives. Here is what remains. Stump Meadow, where the stumps stand out in the open grass like the foundations of a demolished city. Sawdust from the 1880s still lies on the ground in places, preserved, because sequoia does not rot. The Chicago stump, 20 feet high, all that is left of the largest tree human beings have ever cut down. It would have taken about 18 men with their arms outstretched to reach around it. And at the north edge of the basin, above the Kings River, one tree, the Boole tree, 269 feet tall, 113 feet around at the base, the largest footprint of any sequoia alive, the sixth largest tree on Earth. Somewhere over 2,000 years old, it stands alone in an open bowl, which is not how sequoias grow. They grow in groves. It is alone because everything around it was cut down. Out of thousands of mature giants, somewhere between 60 and 100 survived in that basin. The tree was named in 1895 by a Fresno physician after Franklin A. Boole. Boole was the superintendent of the mill. The last great tree in Converse Basin carries the name of the man who ran the saw that took the rest. 8,000 trees, some of them 3,000 years old, went through that basin and came out as grape stakes. The company never made $1. Not one man was ever charged with anything, and the largest tree they left standing became a monument to the foreman. The machine did exactly what it was built to do. That was the disaster. These were the oldest living things anyone in that valley would ever see, and they went down for fence posts. And the record of why sat in newspaper columns and compensation filings nobody reads. Every person who watches this and passes it on moves one more of those men and one more of those trees out of that silence. If this mattered to you, subscribe and send it to one person. That is how the real version stays alive.